Let's continue the story of performance-enhancing drugs and reminders. Here we have Lance Armstrong. Drugs cheat, found guilty, took numerous substances and methodologies used across a long, successful career, and was outed late in his career and stripped of all of his titles. Was a road cyclist. Here we have Christian Coleman, never being convicted of drug use, but has been found with PED violations because he's missed so many drugs tests. Here we have Marion Jones. Marion, let me write that in for you actually, because there's something you might miss here. Marion Jones. Marion Jones was involved in the Bay Area laboratory company scandal. I believe from memory was guilty of taking a human growth hormone, but more importantly was convicted of perjury after lying in court. And here we have not Mo Farah, but here we have Alberto Salazar. And Salazar has been involved in the misappropriation of performance-enhancing drugs to his athletes. No implication that Mo Farah was one of them. And I guess I'm being slightly provocative using this photo in here, but I thought this guy would be more relevant to you because of his association with Mo Farah. I want to be clear here. The cheat here is Salazar, as far as I'm concerned, not Farah. All right, so I'm just using that as it were to allow you to remember that. But this is who was. These are some examples, and I'll come back to the scandals in a second. Now, what I want to do here is that, depending on what you've seen so far, you've probably seen me teach the reasons why people would take performance-enhancing drugs. But I just want to stop here and I want to contemplate what would be the disadvantages. Why should someone be discouraged from doing so? So the first one is that numerous performance-enhancing drugs have health implications. The first thing to realize is that, generally speaking, with exceptions, when athletes use performance-enhancing drugs, they do so in very large quantities. A steroid is a good example. You probably use steroids at some point in your life for some kind of medical condition. It could be for asthma or for acne or for eczema or for all kinds of other conditions that you might have. But they're in tiny quantities in the main. When people take steroids for drug abuse and for ped abuse in sport, it's in absolutely giant quantities, and that can lead to all kinds of health implications. I'm not going to get into the details here, but we could be talking about all kinds of things, from liver damage to change of personality to early death, all kinds of things. Other things, people lose out financially, so they receive a financial penalty. So there's two aspects of this penalty. So first of all, they might be fined, which of course means they're going to have to pay some money. Okay, fine. But it also is to do with loss of earnings, because of course the person is going to be banned. Now, as I record this, the Coleman case has not actually been decided, so he may well be about to be banned for his continued missing of drugs tests, and that's of course going to limit his capacity to make money, and therefore there's going to be loss of earnings. Let's see how that one plays out. If you're from the future to me right now, that's probably old news, but you know what I mean. People also suffer what we would refer to as public humiliation. Let's take Armstrong. He was a hero to so many people, not least because he did all kinds of work around his charity for preventing and fighting cancer, for example. But this guy became humiliated, and many people would kind of refuse to have anything to do with him. All of his sponsors dropped him. All of his charities dropped him. I would imagine a lot of friends left him too. And that kind of public humiliation would be difficult, obviously, for anyone to go through, regardless of what you've done wrong. I'm not ever forgiving someone, but forgiving is not a bad thing to do. Of course, I'm not forgetting what they did. We've mentioned already the loss of earnings from disqualification or ban, but of course they are in fact disqualified or banned from their sport, so they might end up missing an Olympic Games or a World Championships or whatever it happens to be. And this, I think, is really an interesting point to finish this little disadvantages section on. What people do has an effect on other competitors. Now, I guess other competitors could go in different ways here, different directions. You can imagine that if you felt that you could not compete fairly on an even playing field, you yourself might be tempted into at least the consideration of performance-enhancing drugs. Other people will want to go sort of hyper clean and go in that direction, but it has an effect on other competitors. Imagine as well that, I don't know, I mean, it's an interesting one because no one was awarded it, but imagine you finished second to Armstrong, for example, in one of these races, and I mean the guy who finished second was also found to be a drugs cheat, interestingly, but it doesn't matter. Imagine you're the person who didn't get onto the podium, didn't have your moment, you get the sort of the gold medal or the award behind closed doors. Now, in Armstrong's case, those Tour de France victories, they were just kind of scrapped. No one was awarded them. But you take my point, right? The moment you have to win your medal or something is lost from you. Now, finally, guys, I want to talk. I mean, I've mentioned these things already, but I want to just talk briefly about scandals. Okay. So all of the people above I have been involved in some kind of scandal or other, and this can lead to the ruining of sport's reputation. Okay, so sport itself becomes devalued because of performance-enhancing drug use. That's a real problem, and people, as I'm going to put here, people, especially spectators, followers, they suffer a loss of trust. I mean, in all seriousness, when was the last time we could be really confident that everyone lining up in a 100-meter race in an Olympic final, for example, were definitely clean? When was that? Now, I don't want to say something too provocative, but that's an issue, right? Even if they were clean, there's an issue of a loss of trust. Now, what will happen then to the sport is there will be a loss of commercial support. Okay, so if people are losing support and trust of the sport, there will be a loss of commercial support. Think sponsors as an example. And again, this could be the sport itself, and certainly to the individual. Would Nike automatically back, let's say, a 100-meter sprinter right now with lots of money, knowing that so many in the past have been outed for drug scandals? I mean, I guess the exception to that in the men's side of things is Bolt. To everyone's knowledge, was even hear the way I just said that, because I'm almost sort of guarding the future. To everyone's knowledge, was clean. Nevertheless, it's a risk for someone like a sponsor to consider. And the other thing is, and we've mentioned this already in this tutorial, is that when one person does it, it ultimately encourages others. It leads to a culture within the sport. Let's put it in there. It leads to a culture within the sport where people start to believe that perhaps drug taking is necessary for success. Now, I think there's nothing clearer than road cycling in the 90s and 2000s as an example of that. I mean, it was incredibly dirty, and the vast majority of athletes, it would appear, were using performance-enhancing drugs. So therefore, people were doing it because they felt they had no choice. There was a culture of this, and the only way to get there was to do so. And this is where I want to leave you with performance-enhancing drugs. I believe if you combine hyper-competitiveness, let's put it that way, if you combine hyper-competitiveness with money and fame, which, to an extent defines modern day sport, one of the outcomes of this equation is going to be the use of drugs. Not for all people, not in every case, but there is an inevitability, because if we combine these things, now I'm not saying that's wrong or we shouldn't do it, but what I'm saying is that this is almost the inevitable outcome of this combination of factors. Okay, so if our sport demands this sort of ultra competitive nature, and winning brings money and fame, and basically losing doesn't bring anything, right? Well, this temptation is going to be there, and some people are going to make that decision. Cheers.